So this workshop is entitled The Physical Sciences, Human Rights, and Sustainable Development Goals, SDGs. This is an interactive workshop to explore the intersection of science, development, and human rights. I'm Dorothy Phillips. I'm a director at large on the board of directors for the American Chemical Society. I'm also a member of the AAAS Science and Human Rights Steering Committee, and so I'm getting us started today, and thank you all for joining us. So, Lori, next slide. This is our agenda. We'll do some introductions here, and you'll hear from each one of the facilitators. First introduction, and Dr. Mary Kirchhoff will join me in that, and then we'll hear briefly from the facilitators, and then we're going to break out into rooms for discussion. And so you can decide which one of the three you would like to be in a discussion. And then we'll do a report out and wrap up. So that's the plans for the workshop. Okay. And the goal of this workshop is we hope the workshop will help to stimulate discussions regarding technical solutions to the SDGs that we've selected, as well as human rights consideration and social and political and economic barriers to these three selected goals can be realized. But we really hope for the most part that you will enjoy this and have fun during this discussion. So the next slide, we thought some of you may not be familiar with the American Chemical Society, so we just want to give you a few facts, a little background on the organization. So it was founded in 1876 and chartered by the U.S. Congress. ACS is one of the world's largest scientific organizations. Our vision is given here is improving people's lives through the transforming power of chemistry. And our mission is advancing the broader chemistry enterprise and its practitioners for the benefit of Earth and its people. Now, a little bit about ACS by the numbers. So the top of the slide is a sample of ACS impact from awards and scholarships to its robust publications. ACS has many programs to promote chemical sciences and help our members to grow professionally. So we have a few examples. This 11,000 number highlights the number of high school students that have been financially supported by Project SEED, a program that has provided financial support for over 50 years to low-income students. When it comes to our journals, ACS has published more than 8,700 articles, often authored by chemistry Nobel laureates, and that's also true for this year's Nobel laureate winners in chemistry. So it's one of the most, which of course is the most prestigious honor that a chemist can receive. In 2018, our journal articles were cited more than 3.4 million times, and they were downloaded over 130 million times. The Chemical Abstract Services, CAS, has over 150 million unique chemical substances in its registry, and which identifies and aggregates chemical substance information. The CAS registry is the world's largest curated database of unique chemical substances. And so we also speak about our membership. ACS has about 152,000 members in over 140 countries, so we now are a global organization. And so to help those organizations to meet locally and network, we have both local sections and international chapters, which you can see 180 plus and 20 plus international chapters, and over 24,000 members internationally. We have 32 technical divisions. These divisions connect members to the people and information they need to advance in their respective fields of chemistry. So I hope that gives you some highlights for the American Chemical Society. So now let's get specific to the workshop. We have three great facilitators who will be leading our discussion today. I'm just going to introduce each one briefly, but they will give a longer presentation on their background in connection to their respective SDG goals. So first I have Dr. Derek M. Griffith. Maybe we have to go back to the full screen for people to see. Well, they will come up and you will see their face when they come up. You can't see them now. But Dr. Griffith is Professor of Medicine, Health, and Society, and he is the founder and director of the Center for Research on Men's Health at Vanderbilt University. So he will lead the group for Goal 3, Good Health and Well-Being. So I welcome Professor from my alma mater. Next, we have Dr. Emily Lewis O'Brien, who's a senior consultant with the Vermont Energy Investment Corporation, and she will lead the discussion for Goal 7, Affordable and Clean Energy. So welcome, Dr. Lewis O'Brien. And then we have Dr. Robert C. Wingfield Jr., who's an associate professor of chemistry at Fisk University, and he will lead the discussion for Goal 13, Climate Action. So I thank my brother for joining us today as well. But thanks to all three, Derek, Emily, and Robert, for joining us. And we look forward to the leadership in these groups. Now I'm going to turn this over to Dr. Mary Kirchhoff, Executive Vice President for Scientific Advancement for the American Chemical Society. She'll give a brief overview of the SDGs and ACS's approach to this UN initiative. Mary, it's yours.
Thanks so much. It's been a real pleasure working with you and Lori and Karen Garcia in planning today's workshop. I'm sure everyone on the Zoom call right now is familiar with these 17 goals. And being from the American Chemical Society, I tend to see chemistry in all 17 of these goals. But at ACS, we recognize that these were a lot of goals to tackle. And so next slide, please, Lori. We assembled a small working group internally and focused really down on 7 of the goals where we think chemistry can play the biggest role. And so you can, of course, see chemistry's role, for example, in Goal 2, Zero Hunger, through the development of fertilizers and pesticides, with good health and well-being in terms of developing medicines and vaccines and therapeutics to combat global disease. And of course, climate action and affordable and clean energy are intimately linked to one another, and developing alternative and renewable sources of energy is an area where chemists and engineers are going to play a critical role. Next slide, please, Lori. But we further refined this down into 3 overall themes for action that ACS is starting to tackle. Research, innovation, and translation. And you can see that this goal maps very closely with SDG number 9, industry, innovation, and infrastructure. Sustainable manufacturing and chemicals management ties very closely with SDG number 12, responsible consumption and production. And then finally, transforming chemistry education lines up beautifully with SDG number 4 of quality education. So next slide, please, Lori. I'm just going to talk very briefly about why we chose these goals and some potential action items for ACS to tackle. So clearly, to solve the grand challenge of sustainability that are so beautifully articulated in the Sustainable Development Goals, we're going to need new technologies and lots of innovation in order to meet these challenges. And one of the advantages of ACS as a professional society and a scientific organization is that we touch and interact with all different parts of the chemical community, from researchers to industry to entrepreneurs to government labs. And so as part of our advocacy efforts, we will continue to advocate for federal support for sustainable chemistry research and development. The Green Chemistry Act was passed by both the House and Congress. I think it's in conference right now to iron out the details, but it's very encouraging to see that this has been moving through both houses of Congress in the past year. We need to focus on new models for conducting research, and we can bring together the industrial and academic communities to identify ways to translate academic discoveries more quickly into commercialization. And then a real dream would be to work with partners, which would address SDG number 17, to create an international collaboration research fund, which would fund these international collaborations that are so crucial to advancing the SDGs through the application of science and technology. Next slide, please, Lori. In the area of sustainable manufacturing and chemicals management, a lot of our fellow citizens don't realize that everything they use and touch comes from chemistry. All materials have a chemistry basis. And so again, we can work through our advocacy efforts to advocate for policies and regulations that encourage industry to adopt more sustainable chemical manufacturing as well as sustainable chemicals management. We're looking to create an industry roundtable that's going to really focus on those pre-competitive issues issues that are common across the chemical industry, in which collaboration can help advance a more sustainable manufacturing approach. And then again, we can serve as a convener to bring together academics and industrial members in partnership programs to help advance discoveries on a faster basis. And finally, next slide, please, Lori. All of this is based upon education. We can't expect tomorrow's chemists to come up with these innovations in a more sustainable manner unless we educate them in a way that they are prepared, they have the skills and the knowledge and the capabilities of doing so. And so we've been inspired for many years by the Vision and Change report that came out of AAAS about 10 years ago that really helped to transform undergraduate biology education. And so what we're looking to do is initiate a consensus study that would reimagine undergraduate chemistry education with a real focus on systems thinking and sustainability so that future scientists are prepared to implement chemistry in a way that's better for human health and the environment. So those are some overall thoughts. I would welcome any feedback you have in the chat box. And with that, I'm going to turn it over to the facilitators to introduce themselves. And I think we start with Derek, if I'm not mistaken. Yes, thank you, Lori.
Well, excuse me, good afternoon, and thank you for inviting me to join you. So let me just, so let's jump right in. Next slide. So who am I? This is way too much information, but just to give you a background again, I'm a professor of medicine, health, and society. I'm trained in psychology and public health. I do more health behavior type work, but I do a lot of collaborations across various disciplines, have published a decent amount and been funded a decent amount as well. Next slide. So I wanted to just give a basic foundation. I know I'm not sure, given the backgrounds of folks who are on the call, just to make sure we have a good foundation for the concepts that we're going to be dealing with. But I wanted to just give some basic terms that would hopefully be relevant for all the group, for certainly our group. Health, really talking about what that means and how that's distinct from well-being, but how they're interconnected. And so health, of course, being focused on physical and mental condition. Usually we measure that, unfortunately, usually by the absence of those. So that's why we measure things like mortality, morbidity, the presence of disease and illness and so forth. But that's really not the goal, and that's really not the focus. And we need to kind of be able to move to a space where we're thinking about the presence of good health and well-being and good physical and mental condition, not the absence of that. Well-being, again, is a broader concept that includes more than just, whether or not you have a physical disease or illness or mental condition, but includes just your social, financial, occupational, intellectual, spiritual health in a broader sense, in a more holistic sense. And so with multiple organizations, certainly the Sustainable Development Goals build on these concepts. In the US, Healthy People 2030, many other organizations, including the WHO's original definition of health that we've been following for several decades now. Next slide. And so this is, of course, just highlighting that equity and the places to potentially intervene to improve health and well-being occur at every level. This is from some of the initial documents that are being utilized to inform what the recently released Healthy People 2030 in the US. And so talking about the context of a healthy society is really the foundation, but we really need to understand how a healthy environment, again, broadly defined, and how the human-made things of a healthy community and how people have to fit into those particular contexts to think very broadly about what promotes health and well-being. And so that's what we're going to kind of grapple with in our group today. Next slide. And so one of the things I do want to just say before I turn it over is we know that there can be a lot of attention to healthcare. And I know we'll talk a bit about vaccines and those kinds of treatments, medicine and so forth. But we do want to recognize that healthcare is not the primary determinant or the only determinant, or even it's an important determinant, but healthcare is really only one component that we really need to consider when we think about health and well-being. And so we really do need to think of health much more broadly than just whether or not people have access to healthcare and whether or not they have access to certain medicines and so forth. We want to think about health much more broadly and holistically than that. And so this is just a quote from a documentary some years ago that basically just summarizes that concept that healthcare can deal with disease and illness, but a lack of healthcare is not the cause of illness and disease. And it's, it's basically just highlighting the key parts that, we need to basically focus on health being much more broad and comprehensive than that. Next slide. That's it. Yeah. And so this just gets into more of the particulars of thinking about healthcare, and that there's not the relationship, even though we in the US spend a lot on healthcare, that's not a primary driver of health. And so the light blue bars show just life expectancy, and that there's not necessarily a direct relationship between how long people live in a particular country and the amount that they're spending on per capita on healthcare. Okay, let me just stop there. Yeah. So, thanks.
I can jump in then. I'm Emily Lewis O'Brien, and as mentioned, I'm a senior consultant at VEIC right now. I thought I'd talk briefly about my background, and then we could go through the goal number 7 and the sub-targets once we get into the breakout session. But just so everybody here knows a little bit about me, I did my master's and PhD research related to vehicle technologies. So I did my master's degree looking at fuel cell catalysts, and my PhD research was related to synthetic fuels for vehicles. And then after I finished my education, I got a fellowship through the American Chemical Society and the AAAS called the Congressional Science Fellowship. So I spent a year, because of that fellowship, in the U.S. House of Representatives, House Natural Resources Committee, working on energy and federal lands policy. So it's kind of a cool overlap there. I got to work on a number of things. One is leasing of offshore wind, leasing of the outer continental shelf for offshore wind, I should say. So I don't know if folks have been following, but off the northeastern U.S. shore, there's a lot of contracts now underway for offshore wind to be built, and they were placed in several lease areas. This was in the very early stages of developing where those lease areas might be and how that process might roll out. So that was kind of a cool place to be jumping into that particular project. I also got to work on things like leasing land for solar energy, as well as oil and gas extraction on federal lands. I was on the Democratic staff, so we were mostly concerned with the impacts of oil and gas extraction, and I got to help draft a bill related to methane venting and flaring, minimizing methane venting and flaring through those extractive processes. So after my time on the Hill, I moved over to the Department of Energy through a AAAS Science and Technology Policy Fellowship, where I got to work in the Office of Energy Policy and Systems Analysis, mostly looking at the U.S. Power generation system. So I spent some time working on the Quadrennial Energy Review, reviewing the U.S. power mix and how it came to be that way. So part of that was looking at we looked a little bit at utility business models and how rural electrification happened in the US, the policies that made that happen. So that kind of ties into goal number 7 and ensuring access to energy for all people. I also did some work looking at the nuclear fleet and pending license expirations, and then what that means for nuclear waste disposal as well. Then after the Department of Energy, I moved on to Acadia Center, which is a clean energy research and advocacy organization focused on the Northeast. And so there I did a lot of state and regional energy policy, things like renewable energy. Again, looking at offshore wind, I helped draft and pass a bill in the state of Connecticut that mandated offshore wind procurements. I also did a lot of work related to electric vehicles. So both policies to incentivize electric vehicles, like incentives, but also policies like carbon cap and trade programs for the transportation sector. So I don't know if anybody here is familiar with the Transportation and Climate Initiative, but it's a program for the Northeast region to kick off a carbon trade-in program for transportation, which would have a tremendous impact on emissions there. I also did a lot of work related to clean heating, which here means electrification of heating. So moving from heating your homes with fossil fuels to heating your home with clean electric heat pumps. And so electric vehicles, moving to electric vehicles and moving to heat pumps together is considered beneficial electrification. And it's part of the renewable energy or sustainable energy future. It's not just about renewable energy on the generation side, like solar and wind. It's also about renewable energy on the end use side, so transportation and buildings. And we'll talk about that a little bit more in the breakout session as well. And then so finally, I'm currently employed by VEIC, the Vermont Energy Investment Corporation, and I'm a senior energy consultant there. I do a lot of work with clients now trying to figure out how they can do beneficial electrification in their area of concern, and then also working with energy efficiency. And so how to design programs for energy efficiency and how to increase access to efficiency programs for low-income customers. So that's how my background ties into goal number 7, and I'm looking forward to talking through the specific targets with you all in the breakout.
I'm Robert Wingfield. You can go to the next slide, Lori. I am the Associate Professor of Chemistry at Fisk University, and I direct our Fisk Community Environmental Toxics Awareness and Sustainability Program, which is funded by NIEHS through the Midwest Consortium. You can go to the next slide. Over the years, I've done several things. I've spent 12 years in process and product development in industry before moving on to academia, and I've been at Fisk University since 1985. As such, there's several things that we've done over the years in terms of environmental justice, climate justice, and sustainability. One of the things that we like to refer to is how we led a statewide steering committee to develop an environmental justice strategic plan for the Tennessee Department of Environment and Conservation. This was based on the input of environmental justice communities across the state of Tennessee. So this was good, hands-on, went out to the local communities, did focus groups, collected their ideas along with statewide surveys, and put together an environmental justice strategic plan for TDEC, which is still in use today. We conducted community-wide awareness trainings in environmental justice, climate justice, and sustainability. And one thing that I might mention at this point is that this goal, which focuses on climate change, is impacted by impacts most of the goals, and specifically the 2 that we are talking about today, because climate change has well-defined impacts on human health, and climate change is often driven by our energy choices and impacts our energy choices as well. I've conducted workshops on sustainability at several regional meetings of the American Chemical Society. We've also did some symposia there on the finding that sweet spot between food, energy, and water sustainability. We've conducted community workshops for vulnerable populations on emergency preparedness for climate change impacts. And this is very important in making sure that there's some equity in terms of resiliency for all segments of the population. We believe in covering the gamut, as I've said, from age 6 to age 90. So we've conducted some STEM-based sustainability awareness training for youth and after school and summer programs. September was really neat because we had a chance to do some climate change awareness for like 250 kids at the elementary level between grades 1 and 4 via Zoom. So if you ever had experience trying to work with first graders over Zoom, you missed it if you haven't. But that was very, very enlightening because the kids are really engaged. And one of the things that they were doing at that level was looking at ecosystem impacts. You know, being a physical scientist, I tend to look at a lot of the things like clean energy, et cetera. But these kids were looking at the impact of climate change on bees and polar bears and turtles. So it was good. It sort of stretched my mind to figure out how to communicate climate change, to educate these young people on climate change. So I had to be very creative and use pictures of the earth with a thermometer that was really high. And so they realized the Earth had a fever and would come away with an idea of what greenhouse gases were. So we've tried to cover the gamut. And most recently, I've been involved in the development of a climate plan for Nashville. And I've contributed significantly to the environmental justice, climate justice, and equity components in the development of that plan. Thank you.
Okay, great. So now my name is Lori Brown. I'm a Senior Manager for Global Outreach at the American Chemical Society. What we'll be doing now is we will break into some breakout rooms. So the facilitators and then appointed ACS scribes will be shuffled into 3 different rooms, and the rest of you that are a part of this workshop, you're able to pick what room you would like to participate in the discussion for about each of these different topics. So I'll go ahead and do those breakouts, and then you guys can decide where you'd like to go. I think that we have everyone back now. So why don't we get started? Derek, would you like to go first with a report out from your group's discussion?
Sure. So for those who are in our group, we had a nice, robust discussion. Please help me try to recreate what we discussed. Let me start with, yes. Okay. So we chose there were, I think, a total of about 13 Millennium Development Goals in the health and well-being sort of area. We ended up choosing these 3 to primarily focus on. I believe Bill, it was so aptly kind of helped us summarize that the goals kind of broke down either into sort of outcomes or things that you would focus on, or health outcomes that you would focus on, or infrastructure. And so we decided to focus more on infrastructure and those related types of things. So these were the kind of the 3 goals that we chose out of that group. Some of the things that we talked about within that context were related to COVID, and some were just broadly related to just the field and the related issues in general, and the need to. I know one of the big things that we started with was talking about human design and the potential for, we talked about some of the interdisciplinary collaboration that could potentially be useful, and to think about some of the ways that other fields like the arts, humanities, social science could help to think about things like recyclables and how to make those easier for people to access, utilize, and to incorporate into their daily lives, while the chemistry profession may think about sort of the nuances of the details of how to actually think about the recycling, the products themselves. Kind of the consumer company interactions was another big area that I think we talked about, and the advantage that we have to grapple with, that a lot of companies still, it's an advantage, but it's easier for them to use new materials than recyclable materials to grapple with, to create new products. And so that's still an opportunity for us as a group to think about how to actually address that issue. When we got to talking about COVID in particular, one of the things that came up was the idea of, again, thinking about collaborations. And I believe it was Angelita talked about, she's a lawyer by background and training, and was talking about some of the unique challenges in the context of Brazil, and how, some of the within nation politics, may be affected by some of the global politics of, and giving some examples of, say, a country, taking it out of the specific example that she gave, if a country were to acquire a certain number of vaccines from another country, how those politics can be complicated. And so where you get the vaccine, the fact that there are going to be multiple vaccines that are going to have different targets is something that we're going to have to really grapple with within countries and across countries, and how organizations like the ACS could really be important in helping to educate key leaders, key organizations, key thought leaders within communities about the pros and cons of different vaccines, different opportunities, and so forth. And one of the key areas that's going to be important is to think about how data are used and how data are accessible to folks to be able to make informed decisions about the issues that they're trying to address, both with COVID and more broadly. Dorothy, were there some other things? I'm sure that wasn't. You're on mute.
Yeah.
There we go.
I just taking the vaccine area a little bit further. We did get into distribution and the healthcare system, and trust or not of the trust of the healthcare system can make a difference as well in that distribution. And the frequency, the storage, the quality, and as you said, trusting the trust of the science in order to do that. That was kind of some big points in there as well.
Yeah. The only other thing that came up was, I believe it was Bill, I'm not sure if he's back on here, talked about I guess it's the process of developing and distributing. The process, I'm not going to do this terribly well, but there's a push-pull-pull process of thinking about patents and the ways that drugs can be adapted or just understand. Bill, can you just explain this?
Sure. So it's an MSF kind of program called Push Pull Pull. So it's a grant-based program first where you incentivize companies or research labs to take risks on maybe underserved diseases. And then the next step, should they reach certain goals and targets, they get that money, and then they get investment money that kind of pulls them along the way. And then during that, the third pool, the second pool, POOL, is pooling that knowledge together, those patents together, do an open access, and allow drugs to be tested in combination while they're still in the pipeline, and get around some of the existing issues with FDA approval processes and stuff. And that's kind of the way the mechanism is different than what we have now, which is a lot of upfront investment, and then they make that back through exorbitant costs, which they then kind of launder through marketing. It's a little frustrating at times, but that's kind of one way to think about it.
And yes, to the point that was just made in the chat, we were dealing definitely with the idea that it's not just the development of the vaccine, but the distribution and need to actually deal with that we have to get that out to people, and actually talked a bit about some of the cultural and other barriers to people not believing in vaccines, not being, for religious or cultural reasons, not being willing to take vaccines. So one of the things that we were starting to potentially grapple with was, what do we do? How do we build things that are going to help to protect people if they're not willing to take the vaccine? So what are the kinds of things that we need to put in place in our societies to be able to address those kind of issues? So I think that's the summary.
Yeah, I think just one other point was the kind of consumer interaction when you have a drug is to look at the policy aspects of it, not just the medical aspects, but government or policy as well. That was the other point. Yeah.
Great. Thank you. It sounds like it was a great discussion. Emily, can we hear from the energy group, please?
Sure, I'm happy to give an overview and then welcome anybody else to jump in if I miss anything. But yeah, so we started by talking about, what technological solutions are there? And, we came up with a list of things that largely already exist, from solar thermal to energy efficiency for buildings, solar panels, waste to energy, lead acid batteries. We named a lot of technology that already exists. And so we felt pretty good that there was a universe of solutions. I mean, of course, there are going to be new innovations. We talked about a few that could be like total game changers if they come to pass, when they come to pass. But we have tools right now to help address the clean energy challenges today. We talked about a couple different target populations. One was getting access to countries and regions that don't currently have high penetrations of electricity. So not everybody saw the slides, but sub-Saharan Africa is like 44% of people have access to electricity. So it's super low. And we need to be helping those people get electricity, especially in the universe of COVID, where you need power to run your health centers. We also talked about the need to decrease use in the developed world, just because they're countries like the US and other developed nations are the highest users of electricity and contributing the largest to emissions problems. We specifically for underserved populations, we talked about the opportunity for leapfrogging, kind of like how traditional phone lines weren't built out. A lot of people have cell phones, and those traditional lines will never be built. We can do the same thing with the power grid by building local distributed energy sources. So like small solar installations on people's roofs or in communities can really help get over the challenge of building out a grid to reach these people that don't have access right now to electricity. We also mentioned the opportunity, even in developed countries, for those smaller grids to add resiliency and security to the electricity system that exists. In terms of barriers, we did note that policy was a big barrier to a lot of energy reducing behaviors. So for example, zoning laws in a lot of cities force you to build supermarkets far away from housing development. So you can't just walk to the store very easily, as an example. We also talked about building codes that are not super efficient. And so people are building houses that use way more energy than they need to really, or that they could if they were built efficient from the get-go. Talked about behavioral change barriers, so getting people out of their single occupancy vehicles. And especially we talked about the challenge of the last mile. So a lot of public transit only gets you so far, and then you still have to get from the end of the train line to your destination. So that is a barrier. And a third barrier we mentioned briefly was materials challenges. So we don't want to be, lithium ion batteries, while they're the new hot technology, also come with some materials challenges that maybe a traditional lead acid battery does not have. So thinking about those kinds of things when we're building out new areas that don't have access right now to electricity. And then in terms of opportunities, one thing we did note was the rapid shift that has taken place in terms of using Zoom and other technologies to meet remotely, and how that has a pretty large impact on travel and emissions. And people have adapted to it rather quickly. So that does present an opportunity there. We also talked about the rapid uptake of electric scooters in some cities, and how that, because those became popular so quickly, there's an opportunity there potentially to address some of those last mile issues, or maybe there's other opportunities in regions where transportation infrastructure is less built out. So that was my high level summary. I don't know if folks want to jump in and add anything.
Well, I want to jump in because I'm the only one who seems to feel this is a serious potential, but a quantum revolution. We're used to hearing quantum computers are in the future out there someplace, like the wall is going to get built sometime, or healthcare is going to get reformed sometime, but sometime never comes. All right. Where this is absolutely going away, and it's going to go away in months to years, is quantum computing. The breakthroughs are here now. The implementation is in the very near term, and the quantum supercomputers of the future are being engineered and built now. What I'm saying is, once we have the capability to solve the error problem in quantum manipulation, basically more qubits you have, the error problem goes up exponentially. If you can't get past that, you can't do too much with it. We're getting past that not in 10 years, but in between now and 3 years, I'd say.